Rook was flying the proto-truck in spacecraft form towards his planet with Ben riding beside him. He jokes that people call Earth a blue jewel, referring to how blue and beautiful Rook's homeworld looked to him from space, telling him that he reminds him of a sapphire, and asks Rook if he's glad to finally get home. Answering, he says that he is, as he hasn't been home in some time. And the festival was a wonderful time for the Ravonaganders as they were flying down to go land, and they had fireworks starting to explode around them, which Ben figures means that the festival must be starting soon. After landing, Rook leads the way towards his home as 3 girls run over to Rook, hugging him, glad to see him again. He then introduces Ben to his younger sisters, Rook Shi, Rook Shim, and the oldest, Rook Shar. Then a young Ravonagander boy runs over, hugging Rook, glad to see him too. Rook introduces this one simply as a young one, as he still had his Bienthog. Ben says that he remembers Rook telling him that when they come off, they are allowed to choose their own name, and Rook says that is correct. The young one says that the Tesserbursts are full of stories about his exploits. Ben then pats his head, telling him not to believe everything he hears. His travels aren't as glamorous as they make them out to be. The door to the home they were standing at slides open, and Rook introduces them to Rook Da and Rook Brala, his father and mother. Because Ben had actually asked Rook to teach him the important stuff before they got there, Ben was able to properly greet Rook's parents and to leave a good first impression on them, unlike Ben Prime. The meal was going a little better as our Ben had been more acquainted with alien cuisine and willing to try the food. He had told Rook's mother that it smelled delicious and gave some of it a try that he'd put onto his plate. He wasn't stupid enough to use a back scratcher because, again, he asked Rook to teach him everything before he got there. Knowing not to speak with his mouth full, Ben waited until he was done with the bite of food he'd had and tells Rook Brala that the food was delicious and some of the best he'd had in years. Rook tells them that that is quite a compliment, as Ben had been to over 900 worlds and had foods from almost every one of them. The young one starts asking Ben questions about the Omnitrix and how he uses it, and noticing Rook Da's displeasure, he says that he will answer his questions later, as right now it was time to be eating, further bettering his impression on Rook's parents, as food at the table was time for eating, not talking. There was a knock at the window, and Rook's mother Brala went to see who was there, as we see a purple-haired girl apologizing for intruding, but she had seen Rook Blanco's ship and wanted to be the first to. Then Rook stood up, seeing her, saying that Rayona was doing well. She asked if he would accompany her to the Harvest Festival. He says that he doesn't know the plans of his guest, but Ben tells him his guest is going to be getting to know his siblings better. Blanco would be happy to escort her to the festival, giving him a shove to go over to speak with her. After speaking with Rayona for a moment, she then leaves and Rook shuts the window as he returns to the table, saying that the harvest seems to be plentiful this year, though his father Da says that the Muroids have been taking more than the share they set aside for them and have been acting strangely. Ben offers to check that out if they like. Rook Da says that if Blanco was around more, they wouldn't need him to do so. The Ravonaganders exist to coax Amber Ogio from the stone and to keep Muroids at bay, not to bring girls to the window or off-worlders to the table, even if they are well-mannered weak ones. Ben raises an eyebrow at being called weak as they heard banging on the window, and Brala goes to answer it again. And opening up, they see a Muroid climbing their way in as Ben goes into action immediately. Rook does nothing, knowing Ben could handle the Muroid himself, as he'd leapt from his chair completely over the table and Rook's siblings, pulling out his plumber's staff, slamming the end of it into the gut of the rather large rodent as it was climbing through the window, keeping it from getting inside. He'd then jump through the window to keep fending them off. Rook tells his father that Ben is actually one of the most feared men in the Milky Way galaxy, not because of having the Omnitrix, but because he was a dangerous freelance bounty hunter and a magister within the plumber ranks, as he stands up to go join Ben, seeing that there was more Muroids outside than just the one. Ben and Rook were fighting off a rather large pack of Muroids, and Ben was actually doing it without transforming, as Rook's family and the other Ravonaganders had believed he would have to at first, as they'd noticed some of them were wearing helmets with a spike at the top. They were slowly being overwhelmed by numbers as Ben's shirt had gotten ripped from their claws. Getting mad, he rips off his shirt, leaving it on the ground, showing that he was better toned, muscle-wise, than what his loose-fitting clothing showed, and he was covered in all kinds of scars and markings from many battles. Finally having enough, Ben hit the watch, changing into Kickenhawk, as they then began better fighting off the Muroids, with Ben throwing a stone at one that was about to steal a batch of Amber Ogia from another family, cracking it in the head and making it squeal out in pain before they start rolling up into balls and retreating. Rook says that they should follow them to see what exactly was going on, as they don't wear helmets, meaning that there has to be a mastermind, and Ben says that's a good idea, with the two then running off chasing after the rodents, with Rook's family stunned at how well the two were able to fight together, as Rook Daw says that it seems he has misjudged Ben's capabilities. Chasing down the Muroids, the two of them find Fistrick, training them, as he says that they'll use the Ogia to power his Tekadon Star Destroyer, and then no one can stop them from doing whatever he wants. They'll pay whatever he wants just to leave them in peace. It's the perfect plan. Ben says it was the perfect plan, until they showed up, as Fistrick then calls out for the rodents to get into their harvesters, as they run off getting into the small mechs with hoses attached to them. Rook says he will handle the harvesters, and Ben tells him to aim for the rodents, not the suits. Pry them open for faster results. Those things don't really lock well, he's seen them before. While Rook was fending off the Muroids with the other Ravonaganders, Ben was taking down Fistrick, when the rodents that were still around with them began to attack too. He'd hit the Omnitrix and changed into Depth Charge. Taking a deep breath, he then focused on the tank on his back, drawing water from it, and tossed it just above the rodents' heads. The ball then exploded outwards, raining down heavy water onto the rodents, making them scatter and run off, as Ben threw a smaller one of those above Fistrick, and it exploded, raining down heavy on his head, like many rubber bullets, smacking him repeatedly in the head, making him drop down onto the ground and groan in pain. After taking down Fistrick and running off the Muroids, they were able to decommission and get transported away his satellite cannon, then enjoy the rest of the festival, which Rook did get to go and accompany Rayona to, as Ben was telling Rook's family about some of his travels, while putting on a spare shirt he brought.